morning, Dr. Ismail. Can you see me?
Good morning to you, sir. Yes, I can see you.
Now, let me start by saying a few words before I'm going to ask you to take the affirmation. It would have been far better, as I think everyone who is watching, and you yourself may well agree, if you had been able to come in person. Plainly, you can't because of the COVID restrictions which we have. But it has had this effect that there are very few people in the hearing room, and I'll describe that to you in a moment or two, just as I will describe to those who are watching remotely, who might have wanted to be here to see you in person, what the position is so they can visualize it and they know where you are. You are, I think, in a hotel, and there is a member of the inquiry staff and nobody else in close proximity, but not so close that it's dangerous. They're keeping proper social distance. Is that right?
That's correct.
So in this hearing room, you can't see, but you will in a moment see counsel to the inquiry, Miss Richards, who will be asking you the questions. Behind and beside her, there are two members of the inquiry legal team, again, at safe distance. We have three members of the inquiry staff watching and a technician, and we have Mary who will who will ask you to swear the oath. The reason I'm mentioning this is because you need to know who you're talking to immediately, but you're not just talking to us. This is a public inquiry, and I said right at the start of the inquiry that we would be putting people at its heart. And for that reason, you might normally have been expected to sit at the desks in the inquiry room in the center of the room, talking directly to a number of people in front of you. Well, they're not there in person, but they are there virtually because a lot of them will be watching. And there'll be about somewhere between 150, 200 people thereabouts who will watch during the day, and there may be more who will pick up what you have to say remotely. So you're talking to a lot of people, even though there are very few people here. And I want you to understand that, and I want those people who are listening to understand too who is here, what your position is, and that it would have been my wish that they could have attended in person had they wanted to. This is, however, it is important, as I said again at the start of the inquiry, not just to put people first, but also to be as fast as reasonable thoroughness permitted in coming to a conclusion, because people have waited too long to know what an inquiry like this would have to say. And that's why we are continuing our work during the pandemic, and that's why I'm giving you a description so that they understand what's happening here, you understand what's happening here. We have to be here because this is our place of work, and that's where we start today and where we will go on throughout the week. Now,
thank you for explaining that.
Okay.
Thank you very much for explaining that. And I would have wished to have been there, but as you already explained, there are circumstances which are beyond our control.
Now, I'm going to ask Mary to administer the oath to you. I understand you want to affirm, so Mary, would you please?
Please state your full name.
Saad al-Ismail.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence that I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Dr. Ismail. Can you see and hear me?
I could see and hear you. Good morning to you.
I'm going to start by asking you to give us an overview of your career. You took up your post as a consultant haematologist with West Glamorgan Health Authority in June of 1982.
That's correct.
Where had you worked prior to Swansea?
Okay, so I qualified in Baghdad, Iraq in 1970. I did 1 year of what we call internship, where you would rotate between different specialties. And the idea really is to give the junior doctor the opportunity to have a taste of what medicine, obs and gynae, surgery, and I also chose pediatric as the fourth 3-monthly rotation. And then I chose to go into medicine, general medicine that is. I did nearly 4 years of general medicine, and then I came toward the end of the 5th year to the UK to do some postgraduate qualification. That's the membership of the Royal College of Physicians, and have a taste of what the UK system. So I took a few locums and had a taste of what general medicine, and I also did a locum in pediatrics. And then I passed my membership, the Royal College of Physicians, both Ireland and the UK. And then I decided to go into hematology. And the reason for that is partly because I've already tasted hematology when I was working in the teaching hospital in Baghdad, and I liked what I saw there. So I applied for a hematology job which came up in Cardiff as a senior house officer in hematology. So I took that job, and I think it was the 1st of June, 1976. And that job was actually entirely based on what used to be called Ward A7. That is the hematology ward. So my tasks were really to work with the registrar and the senior registrar to look after the inpatients, and the vast majority of them were patients with hematological malignancies. But we would see the occasional patient with bleeding disorder. At that time, I was taught how to prepare and administer cryoprecipitate. Of course, we used to take blood samples from the patient. I finished that 1 year, and then Professor Alan Jacob and Dr. Jack Whitaker. Professor Alan Jacob was the, if you like, the head of the department, asked me if I could stay for another year, and they found me what was called at the time leukemia fellow. They had some money from the MRC, and I worked as a leukemia fellow for 1 year. And after that, they've asked me to apply they had a vacancy of a registrar in hematology, so I applied for that, and I got it. And then there was a vacancy which came after, I think, 18 months after that as a senior registrar. And Professor Alan Jacob persuaded me not to leave and stay and finish my training in hematology and apply for the membership of the Royal College of Physicians, whereby you'd be accredited as a fully trained hematologist. So I did that, and I think just before I sat my exam in 1980, I was appointed as a lecturer in hematology, and I sat my exam in 1980. And then I was in two minds whether to go for an academic degree, an MD or PhD. And then the opportunity came in, and I don't know how I was persuaded, but I was persuaded to go to Swansea to apply for consultant hematologist. And I joined my colleague then, Dr. Khurshid, Mohammed Khurshid, who was appointed in 1975. As I said in my statement, prior to that, Swansea did not have a hematologist as we know it. All the hematology work was supervised by pathologists, whether from the general pathology or from the histopathology. And patients with bleeding disorders were very much under the direction of Cardiff and as what to give. But when Dr. Khurshid came to Swansea, he was persuaded by Professor Bloom to take more active role, and I think the rest of it follows from there. But perhaps I will stop here until you want me to continue on the same theme.
I'll ask you a little more about that in a moment, but just sticking with your own training, in those years in which you were working in Cardiff prior to taking up the post in Swansea in 1982, to what extent did your work involve the care and treatment of those with bleeding disorders in Cardiff?
Okay, so as I said, in the first year, the only encounter would be for the inpatients who would come under Professor Bloom, would need to be treated for haemophilia and other bleeding conditions. But when I became a registrar, it was, as a registrar, then you rotate between different specialities of the hematology. Until that time, my work was mostly to do with hematological malignancies. But when you become a registrar, then you would do 3 months of coagulation and hemophilia, and then 3 months of day unit, 3 months of laboratory, and so on and so forth. So when I did my 3 months with Professor Bloom, both as registrar and senior registrar, my task would be to actually go and see all the inpatients with hemophilia and allied disorders, go down. What I used to do if I was not on call, I would go and ask the registrar on call whether he had any admission during the night, and if so, I'll go and see the patients and then go and brief Professor Bloom. And Professor Bloom always would then come and see them and sort of give me the instruction to what to do in terms of management plan and whatever. But even though the number of patients were, in single figures, really, never more than 4 or 5 at any one time, and sometimes none, he used to spend quite a good time actually to go around and speak to them. His habit was he'll see the patient, examine them, and then usually sit by their bedside and talk to them. And then I would go down to the laboratory after I've done my task in terms of preparing whatever I need to be prepared, and then start to learn about the laboratory side of coagulation. I was introduced to the different laboratory tests, and once I've sort of been shown how to do them, then I was given sort of a stool and rack and whatever, and I was given different reagents and asked to do the test. So that's how you become to know what these tests mean and how to interpret them. I would be called by the hemophilia nurse to see a patient who's attending as a day case. And initially, I used to go to Professor Bloom almost with every single case, ask him what are the plan. He was superb mentor, really, because he would explain how to examine a joint in a hemophiliac and explain the principle of management. So he used to spend quite a lot of time teaching the junior staff how to deal with hemophilia. So, and so when you are on call, you may be called during the night to administer, because the on-call and Cardiff was also responsible to administer the coagulation factor concentrate or the cryoprecipitate. And there were many nights where I be called to administer. I remember one particular night. The reason why I remember it is because it was quite late in the morning, about 3 or 4 o'clock, when I was called to come and see a patient who, and the management plan was to give cryoprecipitate. I don't remember the detail of the patient. But I remember the day because I was flagged down by a police car, and when I've asked them why they flagged me down, they said, in my little dots, and they said, oh, well, you were driving too slow. So I learned that probably when you drive at night in Cardiff, you have to go a bit faster. But anyway, so I remember that. The one thing I remember about preparing the concentrate, that the cryoprecipitate, is that this is the one thing which probably will take the longest time for my registrar to do, because I timed it at one time and it took me about just under 2 hours from the time I reached the hospital to throw the cryoprecipitate, dough it up, and record the units which I've drawn up in the patient notes. Professor Bloom was he was gentle, but he was very strict in making sure that whatever we do in terms of units and batches and whatever has to be recorded in the patient notes, so you cannot leave it until the next day. But the cryoprecipitate used to take the longest time to prepare and to give to the patient.
I'll come back and ask you some more about Cardiff's policies, Professor Bloom's policies and Swansea's in a few minutes. Just picking up then your career, you worked with Dr. Kershid at Swansea 1982 to 1985, and then when Dr. Kershid left in 1985, you became the director of the haemophilia services.
Yes, that is not something you apply for. It's something which you take on, because I was left, if you like, single-handed for about 2 or 3 months until Dr. Biddle came. When I started in 1982, Dr. Kershid was the director. In fact, I could not remember so much of that, so I had to give him a call when the infected blood inquiry asked me under Rule 9 to give the history. So I've asked him what was the history, and he told me that when he first started, Professor Bloom, he then was Dr. Bloom, and persuaded him that need his assistant to provide a better care for the hemophiliac living in the vicinity, even though he told him that he will be guiding him all the way in terms of things are beyond what Dr. Kershid was familiar with. And he initially told him, look, we will make you a sub-center. But in fact, there wasn't anything like called sub-center. But that's what Dr. Kershid told me, that how Arthur persuaded him to actually take it on. But then Swansea was given the full title of Haemophilia Center, and I think the number 151. So when I took over in 1982, 1985, sorry, prior to taking over, Dr. Khurshid, would you receive any communication from UK HCDO? And he would, after we finish ward round and whatever, he would say, Saad, look, we've received such and such communication and whatever. He would show me what he'd received. So if you like, we try to brief each other. So I would have briefed him about any leukemic or any patient with hematological malignancy. Similarly, he would brief me about any hemophiliacs. And that was essential because you could be called at any time. I mean, the way it worked before I reached there, Dr. Khurshid was literally on call every day. So when I got there, so we agreed to share the on-call, and so you could be called at any time about a patient. So you really have to be very familiar with the patients in terms of there would be a non-management plan of what the patient should have. Prior to coming to Swansea, I think we were taught by Arthur that for children, we try to give NHS concentrate because it was felt that they may be, sort of home-made concentrate. They are safer. To be honest, I did not question that until many years later. I thought there must be something known about the imported concentrate. But anyway, so we are told that children, try to give them NHS concentrate. If they need concentrate, that is the severe hemophiliacs, try to use cryoprecipitate. When DDAVP became available, initially we didn't take DDAVP very quickly. I think in the 80s we started DDAVP in Swansea. I can't remember exactly when.
I'll come on to the returns in a minute, and we can see that.
Yeah.
You remained director until September of 2015, when Dr. Percy joined, and then you took over the role of director again, I think, at the end of 2016, when Dr. Percy moved to a different job, and then you retired from the NHS as a consultant and as director of the Swansea service in February 2018.
Quite, that's true.
And your statement says that the treatment of patients with bleeding disorders was only one part of your overall work. Your main specialism during your career was blood malignancies, hemato-oncology.
That's true.
Very roughly, if we're thinking about the 1980s, what kind of proportion of your time was spent dealing with patients with bleeding disorders as opposed to patients with hematological cancers or general hematology?
I think I put in my statement 5%, but that is probably quite an optimistic estimate. Actually, would it be helpful if I give you, when I first started, very briefly, my weekly schedule?
Yes.
And then you could probably be, sort of have a clearer picture. So on Monday, I would go to Neath General Hospital for the hematology outpatient clinic. And we used to do that together with both myself and Dr. Khurshid. And we continued to do that until I'll come back to it later on, when I thought we need to divide the work more when Dr. Khurshid left. So I'll do a hematology outpatient clinic on Monday in Neath, and then I would go and see with Dr. Khurshid the inpatient in Neath, because unfortunately, initially we admitted patient with whatever hematological condition in any of the 3 sites. And then I would jump in the car and then go to Morriston. And in Morriston, I would go and see the patient who may have been admitted over the weekend, see the inpatients, look at the blood films and whatever. And then on Tuesday, we will start again in Neath, because until the reorganization of the cancer services, we also were dealing with hematological malignancies in children. So we would go to Neath to do the leukemia, and we used to divide that. So 1 week would be myself, the other week would be Dr. Kershid, the other person would go to the other hospital. So I would go there and see the patient with leukemia. The one thing about acute leukemia in children, they would have treatment every week for most of the time. So you would need to be there. You need to be there to administer the treatment, because at that time we didn't have any junior staff. It was just the 2 consultants. We didn't have any specialist nurses, but there was a consultant pediatrician, Brian Griffiths in Neath, who was very keen for that we help him manage the patients with acute leukemia. So we used to use what used to be called the MRC trial, so we go on the same schedule. And then once I would finish that, then I would go and look at whatever blood films left over from the clinic on Monday in Neath before going to Singleton to do a very large clinic, which was a Tuesday outpatient clinic. On Wednesday, I would start in Singleton, see the inpatients, and then see the blood films of the clinic the day before, and then travel to Morriston to see the inpatients in Morriston. And we used to do the ward round in Morriston on Wednesday afternoon, both myself and Dr. Kershid. On Thursday, it would be the morning in new outpatient clinic in Singleton, and then in the afternoon, it would be Morriston. And on Friday is the outpatient clinic in Morriston, and in the afternoon, it's seeing blood films and whatever, seeing all the refills. The one thing which probably would horrify any hematologist now is that the outpatient clinic, we also used to give all the day case chemotherapy, do all the bloodletting, what we call venesection for patients who need it. So the outpatient clinic would double as a day unit because we didn't have any day unit. So I've looked at the figures, and I estimated that in 1 year, I would have seen anything between 3,500 to 4,000 episodes. Now, I thought if I see 2 patients with hemophilia, which was very, very unlikely a week, then I would see about 100 patients a year. And as I said, the estimate of 5% was maybe an optimistic estimate. But so the hemophilia work was not really a big part of my duties. The unfortunate thing when I first started is that the only place to give treatment to hemophiliac would be either as an inpatient, or if we need to give the patient as a day case, the patient has to come to the adult ward, the adult cases, or the pediatric ward, and then we'll go and prescribe the treatment. On the pediatric side, the pediatric team would agree to do it. In the adult side, depends if there is no junior staff, then we would have to put the Venflon in and give the treatment. So, and that continued really until after Dr. Kershid left, and it was clear that we could not continue when Dr. Vidal came in. We sat and had a sort of a long chat, and we agreed that we divide the work a bit more. And then I spoke to Professor Bloom, and he said, Saad, you really need to get a hemophilia nurse. And then took me 2 years, and we got the hemophilia nurse in 1987. And that is when things start to change. So this is a very long answer to your question, but really just to put it in some sort of perspective, as when I first started as a hematologist in Swansea, what were my duties?
And your statement has told us that most of the haemophilia care that was provided was at Morriston.
That's true.
And as you described, patients were treated on the ward because there weren't any designated rooms or facilities for the care of patients with bleeding disorders.
That's true.
And as I understand it, there were not dedicated bleeding disorder outpatient clinics in the 1980s. No. There were general haematology clinics.
Absolutely. They really, a patient would be seen in a general hematology clinic, and even though the hemophiliac would take a longer time than an average patient, because most of the average patients is either repeat prescription or just telling them what their blood looked like. But for the hemophiliac, you really have to ask about whether they had any bleed since the last time you saw them, and whatever else really. But they were seen in the general hematology outpatient clinic. We did not start to see a patient in a dedicated hemophilia clinic until 1991, when we managed to get the current accommodation for the Haemophilia Center.
And your statement describes that the main coagulation laboratory was at the Morriston, and you talked about the role of the Medical Laboratory Scientific Officers, MLSOs, at Morriston Hospital, and they kept a record of products used per patient. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Actually, they are in a way the forgotten, people really, because they were instrumental in keeping record of treatment, in making orders for the treatment, and there was one of them who actually got interested in coagulation, and he developed the different assays. So we really had very much this similar type of assays, laboratory assays, as Cardiff would have had, simply because of the interest of this one particular person. And then he did his PhD in coagulation with the help of Professor Bloom. And so when the hemophilia services moved, if you like, to be delivered mostly in Singleton, we thought it would be unwise to remove the expertise and the knowledge from Morriston, whereby all the assays have been done. And Morriston was instrumental because it was the largest hospital. It was the hospital with the largest casualty department. It was the hospital where the cardiac services were started. So you do need a 24-hour coagulation lab, if you like, to be able to cope with all the demands that these services would impose on coagulation and blood testing and whatever. So we kept the specialized coagulation test in Morriston, and to this date, it is still there.
And it was in 1991, 1992 that designated space for a haemophilia clinic was finally made available at the Singleton Hospital, and that's the point at which you started having dedicated monthly haemophilia outpatient clinics.
That's true, and probably prior to that there was another milestone, and that was 1987, because in 1987 I managed to get the haemophilia nurse, a dedicated haemophilia nurse. So the haemophilia nurse, when she joined in 1987, I don't think she really had an office, but she was instrumental in actually shaping the way we looked after the Haemophilia Act. So when she first joined in, she contacted every hemophilia. She started with the severe hemophiliac. She contacted every one of them, told them that she's there, and asked them to come and meet her. And I think they used to meet either in the laboratory or one of the, I think Dr. Kirsch's room when he's not there. I can't remember the details, but she actually started to see a change in terms of the approach of the way we manage hemophiliacs. And she took over from what used to be called the medical laboratory scientific officer, and then changed to the biomedical scientist after that role. So, and I'm still to this date so grateful to the MLSers at the time, but then she took from them keeping count of the constraint we used and preparing the returns to the UK HCDO.
Now, you've told us in your statement that when you arrived in Swansea across these three hospitals in 1982, a home treatment programme was already established.
That's true.
Did that include adults and children?
Yes.
And was that, in terms of patients with haemophilia A, was home treatment only made available for patients who had severe haemophilia A?
Yeah, the home treatment is only for severe haemophilia.
And we'll see from the... Sorry, carry on.
But we will come to that, and I'm sure there was one exception to that, and that is von Willebrand disease, and we'll come to that in a minute, I'm sure. So the home treatment was for the severe haemophilia, and you could see from the returns, the way the returns are made really is to say how much factor VIII you use for inpatients and for home treatment, and how much cryoprecipitate you use for inpatient and home treatment and whatever, both in haemophilia and von Willebrand disease. But the home treatment was dedicated for the severe haemophilia. And the reason for that is really very simple. To be able to deliver home treatment, whether for an adult or whether for a child, usually a parent or guardian, until the child learned to inject themselves, you really need to have regular, if you like, administration. Otherwise, you will lose the skill. So home treatment is not suitable for mild haemophiliac, and even the moderate haemophiliac who would only need occasional treatment is not suitable. It's only for the severe haemophiliac.
But you also had a home treatment programme established for patients with von Willebrand disease, as you mentioned.
That's true, yeah.
And we'll look at the returns in a moment in relation to that. Treatment was not, as I understand your statement, on a prophylactic basis until possibly the 1990s.
Yeah, I tried really to figure out exactly when, but I think if you do have a statement from Cardiff which will tell you when they started prophylactic treatment, we would have started prophylactic treatment either the same year or the year after. Professor Bloom and his successors as well, were actually kept us informed of any new development and any practice. And because we shared, well, our patients were all, if you like, those who need to be seen regularly, were seen by Cardiff. So they would have visited Cardiff, they would have seen the haemophilia nurse there. Our haemophilia nurse would have, when we first appointed the haemophilia nurse, she had to go and spend some time in Cardiff to learn from the haemophilia nurse there what are the roles and responsibilities. A job description is one thing, but to see it in real life is different. And so they kept in touch with each other, and the haemophilia nurse would also attend the haemophilia nurses, sort of meetings and whatever. So when Cardiff started, I would suspect that we started very shortly after.
Now we're going to look at the annual returns for 1980 through to 1985, Doctor.
Yeah.
Shamit, could we have WITN 3761008, please? And if we could go to the second page, please. Thanks. If we could zoom in on that top part. Thank you. So we can see here, Doctor, these are the annual returns for 1980. The centre is, in fact, identified as Morriston Hospital, and you've correctly identified the centre number as 151, Director Dr. Kershit. We can get a sense of the number of patients treated. So haemophilia A patients treated during the year 19, von Willebrand's patients treated during the year 4. And this obviously is prior to your arrival, but when you're working in Cardiff. And then we can see the figures there. Cryoprecipitate used in hospital to a fairly substantial amount, 130,970 units, not used for... Sorry.
Can I stop you there?
Yes.
All right. So these are assumed units. So the 130,970, if you divide that by a denominator of 70, because that was the assumption made that each unit have got 70, each pack of cryoprecipitate would have a 70 unit of factor VIII. Now, let's not go there because, we had quite interesting discussion about this when I first arrived, but that was the assumption. So the 130,970, if you divide it by 70, it would be, I think,
1,724 roughly.
Yeah. So that's an important issue, because if we had used 130,000, I don't think BPL could have made any NHS concentrate. And the similar thing when it would come to, so that was used for the haemophilia A patients, and similarly when you come to the von Willebrand disease. I'm sorry to stop you there.
No, that's quite
but I
right.
thought I'd clarify that.
That's the usage of cryoprecipitate. We can see none used for home treatment for haemophilia A patients. And then we can see the figures for NHS factor 8, 8,167 in hospital, 46,629 for home treatment. And then we can see ARMA factor 8, not used in the hospital at all, but 150,978 units for home treatment. So the bulk of the home treatment in 1980 for haemophilia A patients was with ARMA factor 8 concentrate.
That's correct.
And in terms of hospital treatment, the bulk of the treatment was with cryoprecipitate and some NHS factor 8 treatment.
Yes, that's true.
And then, as you've already observed, Doctor, von Willebrand's disease patients were treated with cryoprecipitate at home and in hospital. And we can see the figures there, 77,000 odd in hospital, 70,000, with in the way which you've explained, those were worked out for home treatment.
Okay, can I clarify one point here?
Yes.
That the cryoprecipitate for home treatment is for the one patient. And let me explain a bit more. We had a very pleasant patient. I met her when she was 16 when I came to Swansea. And she had what we now call type 3 von Willebrand disease. Now, that is, if you like, is a rare type of von Willebrand disease, inherited as recessive character. And so she did not make any von Willebrand factor or Willebrand antigen. And consequently, she would not have circulating any amount of factor VIII, because you need the von Willebrand antigen factor to carry the factor VIII to maintain its half-life. So this is a patient who really had the most horrendous sort of experience in terms of bleeding, because unfortunately she experienced both the symptoms of severe von Willebrand disease as well as the symptoms of severe hemophilia. So she would have bleeding in the joints, bleeding in muscles, but also nosebleeds, horrendous menstrual blood loss, and so on and so forth. And I've asked, because in von Willebrand disease, some of them, afterwards, we used to treat them with concentrate, which got a lot of von Willebrand factor. But unfortunately, at that time, the concentrate did not have substantial amount of von Willebrand factor. Dr. Kirschert explained to me that they've tried everything, even though she was given mainly cryoprecipitate to be given at home. Sometimes they had to supplement it with factor VIII concentrate. As I said, I met her when I first came to Swansea, and she was 16. And she was the most pleasant patient you could have. Even with all her predicaments, she used to bring a smile whenever she used to visit the lab to collect her, whatever. She was very popular. And she used to tell me that her life, it goes around cryoprecipitate. And I asked her, what did she mean? And she said, look, I really can't leave home because of worry about a bleed. I have to give myself, and I looked at some of her returns for 1987, and actually she was having cryoprecipitate almost every day. And the reason I'm mentioning all this, because unfortunately, her life was cut short because of a bleed. And that was, if you would like to say, such a simple bleed. She was in the city center. She said that her legs gave way under her and she fell and she bled. By the time she got the cryoprecipitate, she had what we call a compartment syndrome. She had severe necrosis of the muscles. She was in renal failure when she was admitted to Morriston Hospital. I was there and consulted with the renal physician. I phoned Professor Bloom at the time and said that we have a serious issue here. So he asked me to keep him informed. And to cut a long story short, the surgeon, the vascular surgeon and surgeon came to see her. And they said, look, she's going to lose that leg unless we operate. I really could not give that authority. So I had a long chat with her and her family. And she decided to go for surgery.
If we turn on to the returns for the following year, Doctor, 1981, it's page 6, please, of the same set of documents. Again, we can get a sense of the number of patients treated during the year, Dr. Ismail, 17 haemophilia A, 6 von Willebrands. We can see again the figures for cryoprecipitate, 2,119, 240 hospital, none used for home treatment for haemophilia A patients. And then we can see NHS factor concentrates being used for both hospital and home, 34,200 and 27,720. But the predominant treatment, again, for home treatment is the ARMA factor 8, 100,534 units there, and some used in hospital. If we read across to the von Willebrands, again, we can see the figures there. The total used for home treatment is given as 110,600. Is that also for one patient, the same one patient?
Yes, it's the only person who had home treatment with the cryoprecipitate was that particular patient. And I asked the question, how did you manage to do that? And I think they managed to get her a deep freeze. I'm not sure whether the deep freeze was with a monitor and whatever. So she had a deep freeze at home, and she used to give herself the cryoprecipitate. But as I said, her life revolved around cryoprecipitate.
And then if we go to the 1982 return, so this is the year you joined partway through the year, it's
Right.
page 13 of the document, please, Shomek. So we can see here the figures, and it would appear that the amount of cryoprecipitate used in hospital for haemophilia A patients substantially decreased this year in 1982. And the treatment predominantly used in hospitals, NHS factor concentrates and ARMA factor 8. Does that accord with your recollection?
Well, to be honest with you, my recollection of whatever 38 years ago is not. So the figures are as what you would see it there. We had quite a number of patients with von Willebrand disease, none of them of the severe type. And I would tell you that even for the inpatients, I wouldn't be surprised that so much of that was used by this one particular patient, but I'm sure the other also would have had some of it. That year, we had quite a good supply of the NHS. Just to say here, I mean, the motto was that get as much NHS as you could put your hand on. So the NHS supply was very much not in our hands. So if we were told that we've got having more NHS supply, that was very welcomed. But there were some follow years where we had much less than this. But yes, these are the figures, and I think there must have been one patient who had some cutter factor 8 concentrate because the amount is only small.
And we can see under other materials references to fibre, 38,500. That would have been for a patient with an inhibitor.
Absolutely. We had a child with inhibitor, and in fact, most of the time he was treated with factor 8 because you could swarm the inhibitor with factor 8. He was a normal child. And, sort of he wanted to play rugby, even though he was advised not to do that. And he had some severe bleeds. And I can't tell you exactly what was the fever is, but knowing the particular patient, I wouldn't be surprised if it was not for a severe bleed, which they couldn't control with the factor 8. But I can't remember the full details.
And do you know why in 1982, and we see the pattern repeated later, cryoprecipitate was being used very little in hospital for haemophilia A patients, as opposed to the previous years where it was still being used to a reasonably substantial extent?
No, I suppose it all depends on the patient. And I'm speculating here. All depends on the patient who needed it. Because we had a large family, quite an extended family with mild hemophiliacs. And even though they mild hemophiliac, some of them actually developed inhibitor. And I suspect that, but they were not high responder inhibitors. So you could actually swarm the inhibitor with sometimes even with the cryoprecipitate. But like I said, without having the notes in front of me, I cannot give you exactly the reasons. But one possibility is that the milder patient had required more of the treatment, whether they were the milder patient with inhibitor or not. We had many more milder patients with hemophilia than severe patients. We only had few severe patients.
And we can see that the treatment most given to patients with haemophilia A there is the ARMA factor 8.
Yeah.
If we then come on to 1983, Shimik, it's page 18, please. We can see here again, we get a sense of the number of patients treated. So 15 haemophilia A patients, 2 von Willebrand's patients. Again, a very small amount of cryoprecipitate used in hospital. But in this particular year, there is more NHS concentrate used. So
yeah, we had a good year.
209,995 for home treatment, 68,000 odd in hospital, and a smaller amount of ARMA factor 8, together with a small amount of the alpha profilate.
Yeah.
Would that change reflect simply what was available in terms of supplies, or would there have been some other reason?
Yeah, that's really, so that year we had 307,179 NHS and only 45,304 commercial. Yeah, I think that all depends of what we could get our hand on. And unfortunately, I cannot tell you why should there be such huge fluctuation from one year to another. There was one letter which I remember which came from Tony Napier, but I can't remember the year, where when he told us that because we used, and when he told us not just in Swansea, told us in Swansea and Cardiff, that because we've used so much cryoprecipitate, that our supply of the NHS concentrate was reduced accordingly. But even though we were using quite a lot of cryoprecipitate there in the home treatment, we had a fantastic year with NHS supply.
And Dr. Napier was the director of the Regional Transfusion Centre in Cardiff.
Yeah. So he was. I mean, that was one of the advantage of actually working in South Wales, because Tony Napier was actually a senior registrar when I was an SHO in Cardiff, and so having a personal relationship. And later he actually asked me if I could be on the advisory panel for the blood transfusion service, and I think in the last year he was there. But it was useful because you could pick up the phone and ask if you could have some more, and you would get a polite no if he hasn't got them.
And then if we go to 1984, this is the first return that you complete. So
no, I have to make a correction here. 1984, it was still under Dr. Kershid, but because these forms are completed, I think, in January of the next year, by then Dr. Kershid, I think, either have left or about to leave. So they put my name on it. So 1984, most of it was Dr. Kershid was the director. But that year, I've asked if we could change to packs rather than units. By the way, I think in 1983, your denominator for the cryoprecipitate became 80. So if you want to know the number of packs in 1983, you have to divide by 80. Previously, you have to divide by 70. So this year we started recording the packs, and as you can see, the home treatment, this is the one patient, and also you could see that she also had some NHS factor VIII concentrate.
And we can see in relation to the treatment of patients with haemophilia A, the primary treatment in that year appears to have been NHS factor VIII concentrates, 157,540 in hospital, 240,620 for home treatment, and a smaller amount, although still a reasonably significant amount, of ARMA factor VIII for both hospital and home treatment. So another year in which you had more supplies of NHS concentrate than you had previously. Is that a fair inference? Yeah. And then finally, for present purposes, 1985. That's page 28, please, Shumik. And we can see here 11 patients with haemophilia A treated. I think for the first year we see a carrier treated, and looks like, is that 3 patients with von Willebrand's, the top of the page?
Yes, 3 patients.
And then we can see for 1985 there is no cryoprecipitate being used for the treatment of patients with haemophilia A. NHS factor VIII is now reduced back down again, 50,319 hospital, 75,000 for home treatment. And the main product again is ARMA factor VIII, 64,000 odd hospital, 223,440 units for home treatment, and some Qatar factor VIII coate. We'll come on to look at the introduction of heat-treated products in a little while, Dr. Ismail, but to what extent in 1985, as far as you can recall, would the commercial concentrates there being used have been heat-treated concentrates?
Well, I think when the heat-treated became available, we switched very quickly to heat treatment, and I must say that was very much and with the direction of Professor Bloom. So as soon as the heat treatment became available, we switched to heat treatment. So the thing is about Swansea, unlike Cardiff, because we were a small centre, we did not hold big stocks. So if you like, our stock would be used within a month. And so when heat treatment became available, we immediately switched to heat treatment. And if I was asked to say, how did we do with the finance? And the problem is that I can't remember any problem with the finance. In fact, I can't remember signing any invoice. I contacted the people who were, in the blood bank and whatever, and asked them if they remember signing any invoice, and we were not. I don't know. I think it's probably because we were a small center, whether the whatever allocation was given to the West Glamorgan Health Authority was accepted. Whatever we ordered was acceptable with that requirement. But as soon as the heat treatment became available, we introduced it.
And we can see towards the bottom of this return, for the first time, an entry for DDAVP and tranexamic acid. Is it fair to infer that this was the first year it was used, because there's no earlier reference in the returns?
I honestly cannot. I questioned that myself. How come that so late in the day that we use DDAVP and tranexamic acid? It really all depends as to the person who's preparing this was made aware that DDAVP was ordered, you see, through pharmacy. It did not come through the blood bank. And so whether it was, and I suspect it is, that we did not convey that to the person who was putting these returns together, because I think we must have used DDAV before then, because we simply had quite a large group of mild hemophiliacs. But because this is the only thing I could find on paper, then I cannot be certain about anything else.
In terms of the mechanics of obtaining the various different products, you told us just now DDAVP was obtained through the pharmacy. Cryoprecipitate, was that obtained directly from the Regional Transfusion Centre in Cardiff?
Correct.
Do you recall whether there were difficulties in obtaining sufficient supplies, or whether you usually had sufficient supplies of cryoprecipitate?
That I cannot recall. If you ask me, have we asked for more and we were told that we cannot have any more, I cannot remember any, whether we did or we did not. Because I've got a feeling I could sense what your next question is going to be, is why didn't you switch more of your patient to cryoprecipitate? And we could discuss that if you do ask it. But I can't remember. As I said, we had such a superb relationship with the director of the blood transfusion service, and he was such a courteous and, sort of, he always, if you like, stood for Swansea, even though Cardiff was the main user. So I always argued with him, sort of jokingly, that you only look after Arthur, and sort of, he would always dismiss that, and he said, I look after you more than I've looked after Cardiff. So he's, the quick answer to your question is I don't know.
NHS concentrates you also obtained, as I understand your evidence, from the Regional Transfusion Centre, and you've told us effectively that is this right? Please correct me if it's wrong. That you would have wanted more, and you took what you could get. Is that correct?
Absolutely right.
Was there any were representations made by you or by Professor Bloom or Dr. Kershid or anyone else to Dr. Napier to try and get more NHS concentrates?
Well, I must say here the flag bearer was Professor Bloom, because really he was very gentle, but he was always fighting the corner for us to get more of the NHS concentrate. So I think if Tony Napier would tell us how much he gave us and how much he gave Cardiff, and if I felt that Cardiff had to much more, I know that they have got much more patients, so I cannot argue with that. But I used to say to Tony, sort of, why don't you have more? But I'm sure if there were any noises made to higher authorities, it would have been Arthur.
Now, in terms of obtaining commercial products, your statement suggests. Your statement suggests that initially, this is paragraph 64 of your statement.
Okay.
I'll just put it on screen. In fact, WITN 3761005, please, Shumik. Do you have some water available to you there, Doctor?
I've got it, don't worry. Okay. Thank you.
So we can,
I've been looked after well here.
If we could go to, I think it's page 20, please, paragraph 64. So paragraph 64, I just want to ask you about the actual arrangements, the mechanics whereby you obtained commercial products. This suggests that the Haemophilia Centre in Swansea received blood products acquired on its behalf by Cardiff initially Then later on, products were acquired via the West Glamorgan Health Authority and then latterly the Blood Transfusion Service. Can you just explain a little more what you recall about the processes for obtaining commercial concentrates?
Well, I remember that, Dr. Kirschert told me that, and the MLSOs told me that when before Kirschert came in, all the treatment was directed from Cardiff, and I think Cardiff used to send the product to Swansea. And then when Dr. Kirschert came in, he ordered the products. I wouldn't know whether it's via Cardiff or directly, but the person who was making the orders from the blood bank, he told me that he distinctly remember putting orders via West Glamorgan Health Authority for concentrates. And then there came a time that we all agreed that whatever we need could be ordered by the blood transfusion service, and then the blood transfusion service would supply whatever Swansea needed and whatever Cardiff needed, and then charge us accordingly. We found that as the very useful way for two reasons. One is that we would not come to any product which would expire. I remember during my time that very often the UK CDO would send us a note saying, such and such a center have product which is about to expire, can you use them? We never faced that. And the reason we never faced it, simply because there was a stock of supply held on our behalf by the blood transfusion service. And for a certain time, that arrangement were devolved to West Glamorgan Health Authority, but then was taken by the blood transfusion service and was taken by the blood transfusion service until to this day, except for home treatment of recombinant. But we could talk about that later. But if you ask me when every stage happened, I could not tell you. And I tried to find out, unfortunately, all the records of the blood transfusions prior to 1984. We could not access them, and we could talk about that, maybe an additional questions you may have for me at the end. So I cannot tell you when the blood transfusion service took the responsibility of stocking on behalf of Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and any other, and Carmarthen in South Wales. We found that as the most useful arrangement, really, because we did not have to worry. And if in the middle of the night you have a patient who require a different concentrate, and or a patient who may be visiting Swansea for a holiday, and you did not have any particular factor 9 or whatever, then you could pick up the phone and get in touch with the blood transfusion service on call and get the concentrate. So that was the most useful. But I cannot dissect as when each stage happened.
But between 1982 and 1985, when you took over as director, did you have any direct dealings, as far as you can recall, with the commercial pharmaceutical companies to discuss products with them?
I think you reminded me about one of the reps, I think from Qatar, who came to see me. I could not remember that. And of course, the rep from Armour. I did not have any contact with them prior to 1985, but because Dr. Kirschert was responsible for that. But in 1985, they clearly came to visit me. Whether that for me to put an order directly to them or via the blood transfusion service, I cannot tell you. As I said, I could not remember signing an invoice for Factorate. Later years, when we had the recombinant, I signed all the invoices for the home treatment, but not for the hospital treatment. But I could not remember signing the invoice. So yes, I did see, but I think I only remembered when you reminded me in the letter.
And just so that we see that, so that there's no mystery about what we're referring to, we've sent you some documents from Qatar, Dr. Al-Ismail, and BAYP 607_080. And we can see this is a letter from a Qatar rep dated August 1985. It refers to a meeting with you and discussing your possible requirements for Co8 heat-treated, Co9 heat-treated, and Gam-immune. And then if we just look down to the fourth paragraph, we can see it says, should you wish us to reserve batches for you, we'd be happy to do so. This policy is followed by eminent doctors such as Professor Bloom. The principle behind this is minimising patients' exposure to a large number of batches. I'll come on to the general issue of reserving batches and reserving concentrates in a little while, Doctor. But do you recall whether you did ask Qatar to reserve batches for you, or indeed ARMA to reserve batches for you?
Well, I cannot recall, but if Professor Bloom had asked for them, I certainly would have done the same. But if you ask me to recall, I cannot recall. I think what I recall after is that Arthur told me that he's falling out with Qatar because they could not reserve all what he wanted. But I think because we were a smaller center, he asked me whether we had a similar problem, and I said no. So we must have reserved it, but the mechanism of it, I wouldn't be able to tell you now.
So I note the time, and I'm going to come on to ask the doctor in some detail about the treatment policies. So perhaps this is a good moment for a break.
Yes, it is. What we do, doctor, is we take about a half-hour break, 20 minutes to half an hour in the morning. It's to allow you to have a break. You say you're being well looked after there, but it gives people a chance to look after you again. You mustn't talk to anyone about the evidence you have given or may yet be asked to give, you think. You can talk about anything else, but not about your evidence. That applies to any break that there is. It's also important not only that you have a break, but that those in the hearing room do, and the third and the largest group of people to whom this applies, those who are watching at home, would no doubt benefit by having the half hour as well. So we'll take half an hour and come back at 10 to 12.
Thank you, sir.
10 to 12.